Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen, which will hopefully work. And I'd like to start by thanking both the speakers and the organizers for a really quite fascinating and thought-provoking event. I've learned a lot today. I'm going to try to move through my material quickly because we're starting, I believe, a bit later than was planned. So what I wanted to touch on today is why the UBI discussion seems to be heating up, at least seems to me to be heating up just about now, some of the effects of the pandemic, and this harkens back a bit to the remarks that Dr. Schwartz was making in the first panel, and then a bit onto funding challenges and the Bismarck versus Beveridge debate that I'll have more to say about as we get in. Now, as far as why universal basic income is heating up now, I would argue that there are two main reasons that increase its salience now. And recall, notwithstanding with what Professor de Paris, Paris said at the outset, actually versions of this idea have been around for hundreds of years. I would argue that two main factors that drive it prominence today are first, a perception that technological unemployment is going to drive a need for a different kind of social protection than we've historically had. And second, due to the challenges posed by the pandemic. In illustrating what I mean by the by fear of technological unemployment, I'd especially here harken back to the debate in the United States. This is a quotation from the campaign from Andrew Yang, an unsuccessful candidate for the Democratic presidential nomination, who argued that loss of jobs, especially in manufacturing, was a major driver for his plan for a form of universal basic income. He claimed that experts say that a third of jobs in the United States will be going away in just 12 years. Now, this is in line with a number of predictions that we've seen in Europe, but that seem today to be less convincing. And in fact, it's also in line with the long historical tradition of fears of technological employment going back to the Luddites in the 19th century, Samuel Butler's Erewhon, Karl Koppig's Rossum's Universal Robots, and one of my favorites, Fritz Lang's Metropolis. You have John Maynard Keynes predicting that there would be widespread unemployment because we wouldn't be able to figure out how to use labor as quickly as new labor became available. Historically, the 19th century and early 20th century concerns were largely driven by automation, mass production, assembly lines. But today the concerns are much more driven by digitalization and robotization. It's clear that those will eliminate some jobs, but they're also creating others. And the question really is, what's the relative rate of the two? In a series of papers, the best known from around 2015, 2016, Osborne and Fry were arguing that as much as 47% of the US population was likely to be thrown out of work in a small number of decades due to the impact of digitalization. So is that really true? Well, robots have one level of impact mainly on manufacturing, but that's a sector that has relatively limited employment impact. Artificial intelligence is much broader. By the way, in making all of these points, I'd note the concerns about this technological unemployment haven't been really featured much at all in the discussion up to now today, but I would argue globally, it's an important discussion. Okay, so what do we know? Well, subsequent analyses say if you analyze technological unemployment relative to tasks done, whole jobs are not going away. The nature of what goes into the jobs is changing, but the jobs themselves are not going away. Some of the work done by my colleagues at Bruegel also suggests that areas of Europe that have the highest intensity of ICT take-up, the highest intensity of robotization, actually have higher than average employment. There is, however, a real concern with job polarization. What we see is a hollowing out of jobs with mid-level skills and also a tendency for a growing disparity in wages. So these are serious concerns. And of course, what I'm saying doesn't rule out a long-term concern, possibly with technological unemployment, but it looks to be further out than what many have assumed. This is actually from some work I did with some Bruegel colleagues just a year ago. It shows labor participation in comparison with a measure of equity. In fact, we used the same at risk of poverty indicator as a measure of equity. My colleagues would argue that it has more to do with equity than it does with poverty. What I'd particularly call your attention to is the fact that from 2005 to 2016, many of the countries that perform best in the mix of equity and efficiency had increasing labor participation. Germany increased a full 10 points. That's a lot. And it very much harkens back to the points that Professor van Parijs made in his very thoughtful opening comments, that what we really need is not less work, but more work, especially when we think about our role relative to global competitors. Okay, so with that said, what about the pandemic? Well, we've got obviously huge disruption of production, huge disruption of consumption, unemployment that hits different parts of the working force in different ways, employees, non-traditional employees, and the self-employed. And one of the long-term trends visible certainly back to the 80s, probably much earlier, is a shift away from traditional employment toward non-traditional and especially toward self-employment, including gig economies. What we also see as a result of the pandemic, though, is a shift to remote work for those who can do remote work. And that's especially people like us, knowledge workers. So there's clear needs to provide direct income support to those who've lost income. But most of the aid up to now either has been targeted or time limited. If we look at the trends in work at home before the pandemic, what we saw is for Europe, relatively slow growth. Here, the lower portion represents those who regularly work at home, and the blue, those who occasionally work at home. Here we see the growth over a period of 10 years is relatively slow. This again is a measure by country. It's a wide disparity across countries. We don't need to cover this today in the interest of time. In the US also slow growth, but here's something visible that's also been part of the research in recent years in Europe. Work at home is very rare among those in the lower income quantiles, much, much more prevalent among those in the highest quantiles of income. It's grown to as much as 25% in the US among the highest 10% of wage earners. So it's a very differential trend, and it has different implications in terms of social protection. Now, the impacts of the pandemic have been different, and they've been differently spread across the population. Here what you see is a survey done by Eurofound back in April. Have you lost contracts? Have you lost employment? The deep red represents those who've permanently lost something. The pink is those who temporarily lost something. Probably there would have been more red and less pink if we hadn't had work support schemes like the German Kurzarbeitergeld. But we've had a lot more people who had reductions in hours. Here, the red represents those who say their hours have decreased a lot. And we see in all countries, these are huge numbers of reductions in hours. Many other things changed as a result of the pandemic. This is a reduction in overnight stays from people from other countries, so it reflects directly on tourism, but it also represents business travel. And what we see, even in the way in which we're conducting today's meeting, a year ago it would have been conducted in a different way. Huge increase in teleconferencing. This is the jump in the use of Zoom. You see similar jumps in the use of WebEx, other services as well. So a fundamental change in the way that work is done. And the results from my first set of slides are really much the same. Actual reduction in the number of jobs, not so great. We may even see a net gain as a result of automation, but nearly every job will change in the character of the work to be performed. And this has implications for the kinds of social protection that are needed. Here, by the way, is another result from the same Eurofound study. Did you start to work at home as a direct result of the pandemic? Huge numbers in every member state, 36% is an overall average for the EU. And this will stay. It's not likely to change. Those, again, in Europe, those in higher paid categories are much more likely to work from home than those in lower. what we see really is a change in the nature of work, very much in line with the kind of comments about the freedom that Professor Van Parijs was making in his earlier comments. Different categories of work, also different tendencies based on the particular type of work. I'm moving through quickly because we're short on time, or because I don't want to run us further over. I'm happy to make the slides available. In fact, the organizers already have them. But clearly, some kinds of work are much more likely to be transformed than others. Agricultural workers, fishery, construction, they need to be where the work is. Many kinds of office workers need to be in the office. Knowledge workers like us don't need to be in the office, and today we mostly aren't in the office. That's why we're having this meeting today as we are. So will things go back to where they are? Well, I like to quote the Zen Buddhists who say, when you're studying Zen, before you start to study Zen, rivers are rivers, mountains are mountains. When you start to study Zen, rivers are no longer rivers, mountains are no longer mountains. After you master Zen, rivers are again rivers, mountains are again mountains. There will be a return to some kind of normalcy, but it might be a different normalcy than where we came from. So, what does this say to me about putting some of these bits together? What does it say to me about UBI and about the overall social protection response that seems to be needed today? My take, with apologies to some of the advocates here, my take is that the biggest immediate driver for UBI is as a response to a problem that we seem not to have, which is the risk of massive unemployment driven by technology, automation, robots, globalization. There are other reasons to want UBI, but this driver is probably less convincing than many. We do face, though, a pile of new challenges. First, this change that digitalization is bringing to so many of our jobs. Second, the disruption that the pandemic has brought, not only to consumption, but also to production. If we need more work, it's getting in the way of our doing more work. The increasing wage polarization, the hollowing out of the mid-skilled jobs, all of these imply a need for a different and a broader approach to social protection. And last but not least, the shift from traditional employment to non-traditional employment and self-employment, including gig work. Dr. Schwartz didn't actually say much about this in the early panel, but the Commission has been very active. There's a council recommendation that tries to provide benefits commensurate with need to those in these non-traditional categories of work, especially the self-employed, because the self-employed, most of them need social protection too. Maybe a little less the self-employed who have their own employees, but a lot of self-employed have real needs. Uber drivers certainly have real social protection needs. Last but not least, all of the inequalities that we have due to national origin and due to sex, which we've already talked about somewhat today. So again, there are real needs for a broadening of social protection. When we ask who pays and how do we pay, there's a distinction in the literature between what are sometimes called Bismarckian versus Beveridgean systems. Bismarck, a reference to the German Iron Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, who in the late 19th century was introducing insurance-like schemes. And these are well suited in some countries to health care, to pensions, but they don't cover everything. Beveridge was the great British advocate of the National Health Service, the idea that benefits should get paid for out of general revenues and be available to everybody. Well, today we don't have any systems in Europe that are purely either. Most systems are a mix, but it's widely recognized that the Bismarckian systems, which represent both an insurance and also an intertemporal transfer over time, those don't cover everything. You need more. You need a more universal solution. And with that, I would argue that we do need a shift to greater universality. To me, the question has much more to do with how do you best get to that universality with greatest cost effectiveness, with best coverage, with best social outcomes. Again, support needed for self-employed and non-traditional employees that today largely isn't there in most of the member states. Support needed for those who suffer in one way or another from shocks from the pandemic. Measures to reduce inequality, which at the moment seems to be growing, and something that's come up in several remarks earlier today, also increased focus on lifelong learning and retraining from people who are thrown out of current jobs or who basically need to pick up new skills in order to stay active in the employment market. And so to me, a lot of the question is, how does UBI compare to the more targeted solutions? In fact, it does address a lot of these. It does address a lot of these. Now, challenges, lots of challenges. Demographics of an aging population, declining labor share, the fact that an increasing fraction of our gross value added comes from capital and not from labor. That's been a growing trend over most of the last 2 or 3 decades, a little less in the last year or two, I'm told. And also these changes in the mode of work, where historically so much of our social protection was paid for by employees. As people are less likely to be traditional employees, it's harder to collect that revenue. Therefore, alternative modes of raising the money so as to avoid simply making payouts and inflation become important. So to me, on the one hand, a shift to a more universal system, a more Beveridgean system, a system where funding comes more out of general revenues, less out of these individual contributory schemes, that clearly seems inevitable. The question is how best to get there and how to fund the presumably higher costs. Those seem to me to be the harder questions. And with that, having, I think, gotten through pretty quickly, if we have time, I'm happy to take questions.